Staten Island, one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. Although the least populated of its kind, its history is nothing to scoff at.
Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the most successful and controversial businessmen of all time, was born in and started his path to riches on the small island off the coast of New Jersey. He began his journey with something children these days play with: trains. The Staten Island Rapid Transit System was multifaceted, as it greatly increased New York City's economy and helped set the standard for transit systems to come across the country. But it also led to a corrupt and monopolized industry with a chokehold on the ways people commuted across the borough. The Vanderbilt family was the culprit and the savior as to how the system got such polar opposite traits. And these actions set them and the railway on a course that would change American history for better and for worse. The story starts on August 2nd, 1851, when the Staten Island Railway was first organized. The railway spread across the entirety of the island, from Vanderbilt's Landing to St. George Port. The fact that the railway was practically the only way to get around the island in a timely manner sparked outrage among locals. One local was particularly mad and wrote a statement in the New York Herald where they said, "People are forced to take the rapid transit trains, and this is the root of the trouble." Seeing as the railway was the only way to get around, the Vanderbilts and the other owners had a monopoly on the transportation of nearly everything on Staten Island. The reason the SIRT was able to maintain this monopoly was due to cheap land, cheap labor, and cheap fuel. The public outlook on the SIRT was worsened when there was a boiler explosion on one of the ferry boats. An article from the New York Times said he, Attorney General Ward, brought a suit against the company to recover $80,000 in damages for injuries received by him through the explosion of a boiler of one of its ferry boats. The system that promised effective and safe transportation was failing, and its errors were becoming more pronounced to the people than ever before. Many people had harsh feelings towards the rails, and many expressed this distaste in the newspapers. Some even proposed their own plans to solve this issue. One islander said, "The remedy is obvious. The ferries of the North and East Shores should be restored. This might hurt the Rapid Transit Company for a time, but only for a time." People wanted change, except their views conflicted. Some liked how the system was running, as it increased the economy, but others hated it as it supported corruption. The people were not happy, and the government was not helping. The SIRT was different from the railways of other boroughs. There was once a plan by the city to have 5 railways, one for each of the boroughs, but as construction began, Staten Island was removed from the idea. This action allowed for the Vanderbilts and other owners to waltz in and create their monopoly that put the island under a shroud of transportation turmoil. One reason that the Vanderbilts were able to maintain such a grip on the system was due to how different Staten Island was treated than the other boroughs. One newspaper gave a perfect example of this different treatment in saying, "A parallel to this would be created if everybody who wanted to leave this city were compelled first to go to the Battery by the trains of the Manhattan Elevated Railroad. Such a compulsion would not be tolerated." For unknown reasons, Staten Island was practically neglected. If such a monopoly were to happen in a place like Manhattan with their transit system, where people are either forced or incentivized to take that one system, it immediately would have been shot down. Cornelius Vanderbilt had his downfalls, but suffice it to say, he did create a massive train system that changed New York City for the better. Prior to August 2nd, 1851, the transit system of Staten Island and New York City was subpar and inadequate. The tracks were separated, underdeveloped, and owned by different companies. The system was a problem, a conflict, and needed to be fixed. Cornelius Vanderbilt changed all that by putting the lines under one controller, him. He developed these tracks and expanded into new areas. Overall, Cornelius Vanderbilt was an innovator of the locomotive industry. When Cornelius Vanderbilt started his train system in Staten Island, the Staten Island Rapid Transit, he began his journey of expansion and innovation. For 9 years, Cornelius Vanderbilt expanded his track all the way to Eltingvale, Annandale, and finally to Tottenville. When the track to Tottenville opened up, some islanders cheered as the new tracks would help transit and business, but others were angry that the corruption had spread farther. After this, Cornelius Vanderbilt expanded his tracks to Albany, where he built a 2,000-foot-long bridge across the Hudson. This is when conflict hits. A rival company called the New York Central closes their tracks to Cornelius Vanderbilt's freight trains, so he closes his bridge to their passenger trains. After freight started to pile up in Albany, the New York Central backed down and allowed Cornelius Vanderbilt to use their tracks, and he did the same. This is an example of how other companies broke Cornelius Vanderbilt's system of trains and caused problems. Then, in 1864, Cornelius Vanderbilt bought and controlled the Hudson River Railroad. Then, 3 years later, he bought the previously mentioned competitor, the New York Central. He merged the two railways and put it under one controller. In 1877, Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt died. He accomplished many things in his life, and the innovation of the locomotive industry is definitely the most important. His son, William, not straying from his father's life, continued to expand the tracks by buying the Nickel Plate Road and merging it in with the other tracks. Then the people of Staten Island decided they needed more. They wanted a bridge across the River Kills to New Jersey. One newspaper of the time is quoted as saying this: "Several capitalists who live on Staten Island and are interested in the railway and ferry interests of the place have recently started a movement to build 2 bridges across the Kills to New Jersey." A bill was granted giving the Staten Island Rapid Transit System the right to build the bridge. The populace endorsed this decision greatly and were excited about this. One newspaper said, "I believe the majority of the populace think that the competition of the bridge will bring many Staten Islanders to Elizabeth and Newark to trade, and these friends have endorsed our petition very liberally." Then, people wanted another bridge to connect the Staten Island Rapid Transit with the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey railroads. The bridge was built, and once again the people were thrilled. Throughout the short time period, the Vanderbilts had helped the conflicting train system of Staten Island become a powerful and useful transportation industry. This bridge marked the end of the major expansion for the Staten Island Rapid Transit and Vanderbilt's Railroad. The people were divided as to whether the system was good or bad, and there was no end in sight to the argument. However, a solution to what was thought to be unsolvable was suggested. The Baltimore and Ohio Railway System, the B&O, purchased the railway. This eliminated the Vanderbilts from the picture, ushering in an age of change. The B&O was a national railway company, with cars all across the eastern side. However, the B&O was unstable, and soon began to go bankrupt. The New York Transit Authority realized that Staten Island needed help which they graciously offered. The NYTA began to purchase lines from the B&O, allowing the rails to be more locally owned and more open to the public opinion.
No matter how you look at it, the Vanderbilts had a monopoly, one that was eventually dissolved as the New York Transit Authority began purchasing lines. Today, the SIRT has been reinstituted and is currently operating as an electrical subway system thanks to the Kaufman Act, which mandated all train lines to be electrified to help clear up pollution that steam locomotives were generating. The Vanderbilts and the Kaufman Act worked to better the modern rail system, and the NYTA learned from Vanderbilt's mistakes. Without the Vanderbilt family originally owning the SIRT, the system would most likely be much smaller, less developed, and possibly even non-existent. The system stands as a benchmark for many other railways across the country thanks to them. The system was once a symbol of corruption and economic improvement, but it is now operating as it was intended to, a transportation system for the people of Staten Island.